Welcome to another episode of Tom Kennedy Science. Let's explore the universe together. And today we are going to explore lipids. So, our lecture topics as we follow along once again for my Bio for Health Related Sciences. This is, like I said, a freshman class for non-majors in biology. We are just going to talk about what is a lipid? What are these things that we call lipids? And then what are the roles of lipids in our bodies or for life in general? And what are the different types of lipids? So let's get started. We get these different types of lipids like fats, waxes, oils, phospholipids, and of course, steroids and sterols. Now, there are other types of lipids, and especially if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see a lot more different types. But for our health sciences class, these are the ones we're going to focus on. Okay, so what is a lipid? I got some olive oil here on the right. Well, first of all, it's a macronutrient, and it is one of the four macromolecules. If you remember, the macromolecules are things like carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Now, lipids are mostly carbon and hydrogen, and they are not polymers. So they're not like the proteins and the carbohydrates and the nucleic acids. You don't keep adding all these different subunits together and make bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger lipids. So they're not polymers, but they are either mostly hydrophobic. Hydro means water, phobic means fear of, which means that they do not dissolve in water. So we would say they are water insoluble or fat soluble. That is why when you have like a balsamic vinaigrette and your olive oil, the olive oil, of course, floats on top because it doesn't dissolve in water. It's a lipid. And then other types of lipids are amphipathic. Now, this is an important term because it's a molecule that has both hydrophilic and hydrophobic regions. So we're going to talk about this, and you can see some of these have oxygen attached to them on the right. You start seeing oxygen attached to something, hey, that can form hydrogen bonds with water. Now, these macronutrients, the lipids, of course, they have lots of roles inside of our cells. So what do they do? All right, fat. Yes. Lipids called triglycerides, that's a fat. They're used to store energy in animals. And on the right is a general form of a triglyceride. And fats are a long-term source of energy storage. And pound for pound, gram for gram, ounce for ounce, they store more energy than both carbohydrates and proteins. In fact, you can store quite a bit of energy in these molecules. Okay, they also are very important for forming our membranes and affecting the fluidity of membranes. So our membrane structure is made from something called a phospholipid. And basically, every single cell on this planet is surrounded by a membrane made of phospholipids. And in our cells, which are the eukaryotic cells, they have organelles. And those membrane-bound organelles are also made of phospholipids. And as we'll learn later on, there's another one called a cholesterol molecule, which is very important in animals to help maintain membrane fluidity. And of course, there are the steroids, and steroids are very important for cell signaling and cell communication. And this is an example of a steroid called testosterone. All right, so they can send these signals long ways. And this one can go right through your cell membrane and interact directly inside your cell. All right. Now that we know the different types and different roles of these things, let's go through each one of them. And we'll start with the types of lipids. Like I said, we're going to focus on these three, the triglycerides, the fats. So we're going to look at saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and trans fats, the phospholipids that I just talked about, and the steroids and the sterols. Okay, so triglycerides. Tri means three. Okay, so I got three of these fatty acids linked to that top up there, which is a glycerol, which is made up of three carbons. And you got these three fatty acids. And fatty acids are basically these long carbon chains surrounded by hydrogen. And I've got them drawn two different ways. So you often see these little lines over there, and those lines represent a covalent bond. So that potential energy is stored in those covalent bonds, in the electrons. And these are non-polar covalent bonds because carbon and carbon and carbon and hydrogen have very similar electronegativity. And because the electrons are shared equally, these molecules store a lot of energy. So as you can see, these triglycerides store a lot of potential energy. All right, now, not all fats are the same. We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah, that's unsaturated fats, saturated fats, and trans fats. So let's look at our health connection. And here's our theme in biology. Form and function. Shape matters a lot. All right, here we go. We'll start with the good. There's Clint Eastwood there from The Good, Bad, and the Ugly. Unsaturated fats are generally considered to be healthy for you. You get those from things like olive oils, fish oils, sunflower oil, mixed nuts. These are good sources of unsaturated fats. This is an example of an unsaturated fat on the right. They have a double covalent bond between the carbons, a double covalent instead of a single covalent bond. So therefore, they are unsaturated in hydrogens, which also means they have a little bit less energy because there's fewer hydrogens in there. And the most important part here is that those double bonds cause those tails to bend. And as a result of the bending action, these fats don't stick together very well. Imagine taking paper and wadding it up. They won't stack very nicely, but they'll remain liquid at room temperature. That's why olive oil is liquid. And if you put it in a refrigerator or freezer, it'll actually solidify, but at room temperature, it is liquid. And we also get these from fish oils as well. And here's the thing, essential fatty acids or essential fats. We need these, but we can't make them. So we get them from the foods we eat. And two examples are omega-3 and omega-6. The next one are the saturated fats. Yeah, all that yummy stuff like fried foods, burgers, donuts, all the, stuff that tastes very nice, but not that great for you. Saturated fats are saturated in hydrogens, okay? And their fatty acids are straight chains. And as a result, they stack, right? And because they stack, guess what? They can form plaques in your arteries. All right, so that's not good. So they're also solid at room temperature. So if you've ever cooked bacon and all that fat comes out of the bacon in the frying pan and then you let it sit and it cools, right? It forms a solid. That's because these fats are stacking and being a solid at room temperature. And that's kind of what they're doing in your arteries. So they're not that good for us. And then there's the ugly. These are the trans fats, hydrogenated vegetable oil. Okay, trans fats are actually unsaturated fats, but what happens here is they have the double bonds, but the carbons are across from each other, hence trans rather than on the same side. So instead of bending the tail looks straight, right? You've got an unsaturated fat that looks like a saturated fat, and that double bond, you're probably thinking, is it harder to break two bonds or one? It's harder to break two. This is harder to break down. And like I said, I always say, don't worry about avoiding too many things. Always eat things in moderation. But if you can avoid something, avoid the trans fats. They're just not that good for you. All right. Yeah, so hard to break down. But here's a take-home message about fats. Even olive oil, which is considered good for us, is loaded with calories. And we do need some omega-3 and omega-6s in small quantities. And then basically, the saturated fats aren't that great for you. Trans fats are even worse. So you want to try to avoid the trans fats. And watch out for fat-free diets. A lot of foods that are fat-free are loaded with sugar. So that's something to keep in mind there. All right. Our next type is the phospholipid. And phospholipids form cellular membranes. And you're going to notice they are amphipathic. Think of like amphibian, like frogs, right? They have a tadpole stage in the water, and then the adults live on land most of the time. There are frogs out there that skip the tadpole stage altogether and never go to water. I know, weird. But here it is. If you've got a phospholipid up here, that is hydrophilic. It can form hydrogen bonds with water. And then the fatty acid tails down here, those are hydrophobic, and they're not going to interact with water. All right. So the hydrophilic phosphate heads with these hydrophobic fatty acid tails. And these cellular membranes, they form a phospholipid bilayer. I know that's a lot of words there. That's very technical sounding. Phospholipid bilayer. Okay, we got a lipid. It's got a phosphate group attached to it. All right, phospholipid bilayer, which means there are two layers. And you can see right there, there's one layer with the fatty acids, and then there's the second layer, and there's the phosphate groups on the outside. All right, so this is because the phosphates are hydrophilic, they're going to act with the water on the outside, and then those fatty acid tails are going to turn on the inside. And that's actually thermodynamically favored, so these membranes will actually form that on their own. The cells don't have to do a lot of work to do this. And a cellular membrane is about 50% lipid, phospholipid to be specific, and about 50 or so percent proteins. They are actually incredibly complex structures. And they also have a feature called selective permeability because the interior is made up of fatty acids. It is hydrophobic and only certain things can pass through. And I will talk a lot about membrane permeability in another chapter. Okay, and then lastly, we have the steroids and the sterols. This is an example of cholesterol. Animals need cholesterol in our cell membranes. An example of a sterol, which is a type of steroid. So other types of steroids include estrogen, testosterone, and of course the cholesterol, which is our sterol, which we actually make estrogen and testosterone from in some ways. So the steroids are hormones, and they're used to carry signals long distance. And these can pass right through our cellular membrane and interact directly with the receptors inside the cell. And when they do that, they initiate several types of cellular responses. For example, testosterone acts on a body to produce more muscle. It can grow more body hair. It basically turns you into a male, which is different from a female, by initiating all these different changes. And they're very similar. This is a methyl group right there. Estrogen lacks it. And then the other one also, there's a hydroxyl group versus a carbonyl group. So there's some minor changes in the shape there, but there it is once again, form and function, shape matters. Okay, now here's our sterol, here's cholesterol. And cholesterol is, like I said, incredibly important for cellular membranes. Cellular membranes are like a soap bubble. They're also called plasma membranes because they move around, but you don't want them too fluid, nor do you want them too rigid. And in animal cells, cholesterol helps maintain the right fluidity, so things like oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily cross the membranes, but not too easily. Now, you've probably have heard of good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. What this really is are the protein structures that are carrying cholesterol throughout your body. See, cholesterol is mostly hydrophobic, so you need to put it in something that can be transported in your blood. And to do that, we have what is called the LDL, which is a low-density lipoprotein, and we have the HDL, which is a high-density lipoprotein. So, LDLs, this is the low-density lipoprotein, so it's a protein with lipids, and it's the bad cholesterol. And the reason why is because it contributes to fatty acid or fatty buildups in our arteries. So LDLs are taking cholesterol from the liver and moving them to our peripheral cells. Now, the problem with these is with that fatty buildups in our arteries, that leads to vascular disease with higher risk of heart attack and strokes. Now, in contrast are the HDLs. These are the high density lipoproteins. This is the good cholesterol because it carries the cholesterol away from the arteries and back to the liver. So it's going to help remove the LDLs, right? And that's going to prevent those plaques from getting built up. So you have a lower risk of vascular disease and you're going to have fewer heart attacks and strokes. All right. Now, why this matters? I mean, 28 million people in the US have heart disease. That's a lot. And like it kills 647,000 people a year. That's like 1,770 people every day or about 1.2 people every minute. So heart disease really matters. Heart attack almost every 40 seconds. So it's important, I always tell everybody to go get a doctor and get your blood work done and make sure you don't have high cholesterol, high triglyceride levels in your blood. And if you do, you might need to exercise more, change your diet, or talk to your doctor, maybe even go on medication because heart disease can be prevented to some degree if you take proactive steps. And as you get older, your cholesterol levels will slowly start to creep up and it will catch up with you. All right. Well, until next time, hope you enjoyed this and hope you learned something. Stay curious.